Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Embedding Equity-Centered Practices in the Assessment Cycle session. My name is Kaylon McCabe, and I'm moderator for this session. And before I introduce so sorry, it's been a long day. The presenters will introduce themselves, but I've got a few housekeeping rules. Please note that we're in Zoom meeting and that you have both video and audio microphone capability. Yet we ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you're interacting in some way, for example, during a Q&A. Please take your cues from our presenters and from me so that we may create a productive environment for all. Should you have comments otherwise, please enter them into the chat box, and as time allows, share your questions with the presenters. Additionally, you may use the chat feature to share thoughts with the presenters and or each other. You'll also have the ability to post reactions, thumbs up, etc., and feel free to use those as appropriate. Thank you for being with us in the session today, and I will be putting in the chat toward the end a link for a survey. And now our presenters, thank you very much, will introduce themselves. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Lundquist. I use pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a white, cis, third-generation educated, currently able-bodied woman. And I live in Tucson, Arizona, the land of Tohono O'odham. My current role is with Anthology, which is formerly Campus Labs, an ed tech company that works with higher education. And I serve there as the Vice President for Campus Strategy. And CG, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Good morning, I think your time. I'm out here in the East, so it's later in the afternoon for me. My name is CG Heiser, and I am also cisgendered, white, female identified, straight individual. And I am a first generation college student and now officially completed my doctoral work. So first generation doctorate student. So my family's very excited for that. Historically, growing up, I grew up well below the poverty line and have transitioned to a different socioeconomic status as I have grown and my circumstances have changed. My doctoral work focused on cultural responsiveness with quantitative methods and how that can influence or accurately, validly share results and articulate student learning across diverse populations. So that was one of the things that will inform some of the things Ann and I will share today. Thank you for kicking us off, Ann. We wanted to start by covering some basic terms just to be really clear. We don't want to take these terms for granted. We know that language matters. So when we're talking about diversity, we really mean difference. And this can mean difference in the sense of identities or difference in thought processes and how we make meaning out of things. Inclusion is both the act of being inclusive as well as an environment, right? We facilitate inclusive spaces. Equity is about fairness and justice, and this is not the same as being equal or necessarily even having equal resources and services for different groups of individuals. And social justice is to act in a way that fosters a just society with equitable treatment. Also, you can think of this as sociocultural norms of justice and equity. So when we move throughout today's presentation, we're really specifically talking about assessment and equity we're talking about equity around the assessment process and in the practice itself. We're thinking about equity as aligning resources with need and the role that the assessment process can play in fostering that alignment. In shaping today's conversation, we really wanted to frame it in terms of considering equity and assessment through systems, through self, and through practice. And this is really how we're going to organize our time, or to use an expression that Ann used when we were talking earlier, this is the arc of our presentation. I just really like that language.
Thanks, CG. So one of the things we thought, since we only have an hour and we have a large group, to think about interacting, maybe having a piece of paper or your computer out, and maybe this is just an idea that might work for you. Maybe on one side of the paper, we're going to talk about a lot of ideas, attitudes, practices. So you may not have recognized them as equity-centered practices. So you might just jot down where you're already doing this work that you hadn't really considered it in that framework. And then you also might keep track on the other side of new ideas or things to try. And with that in mind, we really would encourage you to use the chat. We may not be able to monitor it the whole time while we're also presenting, but we'll save it and be back in touch with people. But if you have a practice and you want to share an idea, please do so and include your name and your email so that others can be in touch with you about that. So we're going to start by talking about systems just very briefly, right? So we know that we all live and operate within the larger systems in our world and our culture, and these are often unexamined and not even a part of our awareness. They're just the way things are. You all operate clearly within the largest, I believe, community college system. And so that brings with it mission, norms, procedures, ways of doing things, some explicit, others implicit. And then there's the social and cultural context of your state or your region, student populations that probably differ broadly across the state of California. And then we like to think about the systems of accountability, right? So you've got accreditation, where there's already, compared to many other accreditors, a lot of attention, not only to student outcomes, but to equity in the academic program, to thinking about delivery modes and teaching ideologies, programs and practices and services that support a diverse faculty and staff and student population. We can also think about things like boards, governing boards, state funding, and laws and regulations that govern our institutions, guided pathways programs. I'm just thinking of all the ways in which there are these larger systems that we are responsive to and a part of. So I just wanted to mention here, CG and I, we're going to talk in just a minute. We're going to focus our talk on thinking about student learning outcomes assessment. We generally have many kinds of assessment. I'm a former director of assessment also at Western Michigan University. And so interestingly, we think about, of course, things like national surveys and program assessment and evaluation, but we're going to try to focus our topic and our example on student learning outcomes assessment specifically. And we know that you all are already thinking about that in part because of the accreditation requirements. But the other thing that we want to frame this around is that there's this sort of larger context. And as Walhirsch and Rogers point out, assessment, we believe, should be conceived as a practice that attends more fully to the social and political position that it occupies within an institution. And one of the ways that we think about that is to think about this larger context of culture. Our iceberg image here has the things above the water that we see, such as behaviors and language or symbols, speech, attitudes. And then all those things that we don't see and often therefore don't think about, which are under the water. So if we just take racism, for example, as an example, we are all fairly familiar at this point in time that race is a construct, a social construct. It was created to categorize and oppress certain groups and sustain privilege and power in others. And so even if race isn't real, the categorizations actually have real impacts, right? The categories to which we may be externally assigned or with which we currently identified. And this is woven within an ideology of white supremacy, which is historically based. So without going too deep about this, we just want to point out that these are not the kinds of things we often think about explicitly when we're conducting our assessment work. And we're talking about raising those to the surface in a way that they become more obvious and apparent to us. One of the ways that that happens for us, we think, is that these foundational assumptions, also like our philosophical paradigms associated with research practices, which then sort of morph into the assessment practices that we use, our worldview, culture, these are all undergirding the procedures and the methods that we actually select. So as we often think, people will say, I'm going to conduct a survey. They're way at the top of the iceberg. And down below are all these other foundational pieces that are never examined. Something, for example, like a positive perspective where there's only one truth. And our goal with this assessment is to find the truth, right? Maybe a preoccupation with procedures and process, or quantitative measures being privileged over qualitative, or I really need to separate the knower from the known. These are just ways in which these unconscious and unexamined pieces show up in our assessment practice. So as we finish thinking about this idea of systems and move to the self here, we're sort of positing that assessment, while it has activities associated with it and all kinds of procedures and methods, we're liking to think about assessment actually as a state of mind, like the approach that we bring to it, the way that we consider it. And when we're thinking about the intersection between equity and assessment, really there's this concept of equity mindedness. So to be equity minded means that the institution as a whole is focused on practices that are evidence-based. They're looking at systems, not just individuals. There's measurable goals around advancing equity. They're race conscious and conscious of all other kinds of identities and marginalized populations. And they're deliberate in their approaches to understanding experience and making change. There's a lot of great work you may already be familiar with Estella Ben-Simon at the Center for Urban Education at University of Southern California. Their webpage has lots of information about practices related to this. And I know they've facilitated conversations with several community colleges in California, I believe chancellors and others. So you may already be using their work extensively. So that's sort of our setup for this idea of systems and the things that we believe need to be considered as a part of any assessment practice before we get to procedures. And I'm going to turn it over to CG, shift gears to the self here.
So I wanted to transition and also include that self piece. And this is a really nuanced piece of what we wanted to talk about today, because in understanding, MacArthur in their 2017 article really talked about that reform means not just a change in our practice, but also a change in how we view and understand our role in the practice. And we know as human beings, we grow, we learn, and we develop in cultural context. And this cultural context shapes how we learn, and it shapes also meaningful demonstrations of that learning. And for the researcher or the assessor in a process, this also means focusing on your own culture, your own biases, your positionalities, and how that shapes the ways in which you engage in the assessment process. It's also about mindfulness and knowing in a visceral way that we are embodying the systems and structures within us and through us that we experience, and we bring those experiences to our practice. We wanted to also spend some time on positionality, but also this idea of agency and power. So positionality is really what shapes our understanding of self. It's, it's more than just the list that Anna and I kind of discussed when we were introducing ourselves and who we are and some of our identities, but that shapes our worldview and how we understand and make meaning. But it also shapes our sense of agency, which is internal. Anne can't give me a sense of agency, but she can foster spaces in which I feel like I can truly come to the table and operationalize my voice and share in my own instilled sense of agency. So it can positionality shapes that agency. It also shapes our understandings of where we see power or don't. If you've ever had an experience of bias and you've shared it with another individual and their response was, well, I didn't see it that way. That's an example of how different people in their different positionalities may understand power dynamics or instances of privilege and bias. And so when we think about agency in the world of assessment, we think about shifting gears from our students as participants or subjects in a study, and instead as experts in their own lived experiences. We think about facilitating spaces where they can operationalize their agency. We think about breaking down power dynamics and bringing them to the table to share in rich and nuanced ways, not only what they're learning, but how they're learning, and making them the experts in their own lived experiences. Because for Anne and I and many others who are engaging in this conversation around the country, we understand that the power of assessment, it influences who benefits from the work. It influences narratives around our student populations, but it's embedded in our practice. And the sense of power is shaped through the systems and structures that in many instances have caused harm in the history of higher education. And it's up to us to determine to what extent we want to embody these in our bodies, but also in our practices. And Anne's going to share a little bit more about that idea with you.
Okay, I'm switching screens to mute and unmute. So one of the things we wanted to talk about and actually practice here for a moment is this idea of being what we call an aware assessor. So a lot of us in this equity-centered assessment space have been talking about this idea. And these are just some of the things that we think about. And I'm also a yoga teacher and a meditation teacher. And so at first, those identities were very separate for me. I'm an assessment practitioner and I meditate and I'm a yoga teacher. They had nothing to do with one another. Increasingly, maybe it's getting older, maybe it's my increased awareness, but these identities have come together and they don't seem separate to me at all. They may to you right now, but they don't feel separate from my experience. So for those of you familiar with mindfulness practices, there's a couple of things we wanted to point out. There's the awareness piece, this gentle, inquisitive, don't know mind, which I think often we feel like we need to come to assessment with, a hypothesis and then the methods and the structures. And I'm not discounting that approach. It's a valid approach in many situations, but there are other approaches where we really don't know. The situation is so complex. And it's so embedded with those systems and structures and with identity and positionality that there's not a simple way in. And so we have to probably step back and be more inquisitive and curious. We also are going to have to sit with our discomfort. We are used to being experts. I need to know the answer. So that idea of being able to sit with discomfort and also to place a pause when needed. So we've got reflection questions embedded in the second half of our presentation, and we're situating them as an example of a way to do an actual equity pause while you're doing your work. And so that's something we'll share with you in the last section. And then there's this idea of embodiment. So embodiment really means that we're feeling and knowing something in our bodies. We tend to think with our cognitive mind. We prioritize that in higher education. The written and spoken word is the way in which we demonstrate our scholarship and our knowledge and our value within the institution. And we know from all the research that people, faculty, staff, students, they learn, they experience, and they demonstrate knowledge in multiple kinds of ways. And even though we might talk about that in our curriculum, we tend to lean towards assessment that follows a pretty narrow lane. So what we thought we would do, if you are up for it, and this is pure choice on your part, is we're going to take a 5-minute embodiment practice pause. And so we're going to do this as an experiential piece of learning, just as a way to demonstrate what the pause might look like and what it also might feel like to become aware in your own sense of self as opposed to the external environment. So if you're comfortable and you want to, you can gently close your eyes here. This will just be a few moments of time so your logical mind can say, I'm not going to be here forever. If it's not comfortable to close your eyes, you can simply have a downward gaze, or perhaps just look away from the computer. And then just settle in and find your posture. If you're in a seat where you're leaning back and it's available to you to just gently lean forward so that you're not resting against the back of the chair, if you certainly need to use the back of the chair, absolutely do so. And then I'm going to offer a few suggestions about what this pause might look like. And remember that what I'm offering is only a suggestion and only do what feels right and comfortable for you. If it doesn't feel right, just pause in your own way. So wherever you are in that seat, bring your attention to the breath at the abdomen. Just noticing the in and out of your breath, not trying to shape it in any particular way, just noticing the breath rising and falling. And if the mind wanders, that's what the mind does. So just notice the wandering. And then shift your attention to your body. Awareness of the body sitting here, being here. Not losing the thread of the breath. We're just going to trace the body. And as we do that, notice if there's any place where you might, without forcing or struggle, just soften. Bring your attention to the top of the head, the forehead, the temples, the breath in and out through the nose. Nothing to do right this minute, just be. No right or wrong way to do this experience, just your experience. And move your awareness down through the neck and the throat to the shoulders. Not labeling any awareness of sensation there as good or bad, but perhaps just noticing pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Down through the arms and the wrists and the hands. Center of the chest, the abdomen, the belly, pelvis and hips. If any stories arise about the body, just notice them, allow them to pass. If attending to the body in this way feels unsafe in any way, just leave your eyes open and return to the breath or focus on something else, another object in the room. Continuing the awareness in the upper back, the mid back, the lower back, the seat. The thighs, the knees, the shins, the feet. Just rest. Rest in the body. Our Western way of thinking has an artificial disconnection between the body, the mind, and the spirit. And that disconnection has done damage not only to individuals, ourselves, but also to the collective as we devalue, commodify, objectify bodies of whole groups of people. Shift your attention to the abdomen. Notice the breath rising in and out. Breathing in, I'm aware that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I'm aware that I am breathing out. And then with the attention at the heart center, just behind the sternum, maybe just repeating to yourself, may I be peaceful and at ease. And then expanding that compassionate awareness out to include all others, all beings, known and unknown, liked and disliked. And maybe offer this, may all beings be at ease and peaceful. And gently bringing your awareness back to the body, sitting or resting here. And expanding that awareness of the body. If your eyes are closed, gently opening them, bringing your attention back to the workshop, the PowerPoint, the computer. So that's just one form of self-practice that we wanted to share with you and offer. And then we're going to now shift to our cognitive mind and move back to the assessment practices. And we're going to talk about those in some specific ways. So I'm going to share it back with CG.
We hope you enjoy our small play on words there with the practice of self and self-engagement, but also in the practice of shifting into the assessment work that we do and the cycles and the process in which we engage. Thank you so much for indulging us. And I don't know about you, but I found myself wondering towards the end there how I was supposed to make it through this presentation in such a lovely lull that Anne had brought me to in a space of relaxation. So thank you, Anne, for guiding us through that. So I want to, shifting gears, I want to go back into this idea of the assessment cycle and the context in which it operates, right? So we know that assessment as a practice is deeply contextual. It's shaped by the cultures around us, but it's also shaped by the positionality and the sociocultural norms of the individual conducting the practice, as well as the students who are giving us their answers and their responses and telling us about their learning practice. So it's so dynamic in all of the ways in which culture can intersect with this one process. But there's also program context, department context, or college or divisional context, as well as institutional context, right? There's a context around community colleges nested in a state system. And all of these things can influence the assessment process and the assessment cycle. These facts shape how we as practitioners engage in the process, but they also influence the effectiveness, the measures of student learning that we choose, and if we're doing it well and thoughtfully, and some could argue right if there was only a single definition, which we know there's not, but it can also influence culture, right? When we get that data set that says, here's how we are or aren't serving, we can make these changes to shape our culture to be more inclusive, to be better serving of students, or even to celebrate where we're doing amazing work, right? We know that it can influence culture. It's powerful in that way. So we wanted to dig into some really specific strategies throughout the cycle, but we wanted to share that there are really 4 equity-centered principles to guide our engagement throughout the assessment process. And these focus on navigating those contexts that influence the cycle and the process, which are shaped by systemic biases, barriers, and discrimination. We know that collaborating with students as critical stakeholders is critical for educational practices to be more inclusive and equitable. We encourage everyone here and those that we can share this information with to really consider non-dominant approaches to learning demonstrations, and how we measure those learning demonstrations. And last, we really want to encourage to remain aware of the positionality, privilege, and power that we bring to every space in our practice. So as we work our way through the assessment cycle, we'll share some broad considerations for you at each stage, some concrete examples of practice, as well as some reflection questions. And we're going to start with determining outcomes. The broad considerations we want to share with you at this phase, at this stage, is really thinking about your equity framework and the justifications for that framework. Not justification in terms of defense, but where is this coming from? Why are we on this path? And where is the foundational model that informed this existing framework that we might adopt or develop? Was it grounded in employability, so capitalistic notions? Is it grounded in connections to land and earth and spirit? Where is this grounded, and why is this the right model for our students? When we think about many of our outcomes frameworks that we are the most familiar with are shaped by dominant paradigms and positionalities and epistemologies and beliefs. And so we have to look a little deeper for the ones that are not. And so we encourage that though, and we have some resources that we can share about that. It's also about why we might engage in those paradigms and what that means for us. So for some examples and practice of this work, we want to think about how to include students and share an example of including students in outcome development and in pilot testing. So when I was at one institution, we were developing our student affairs learning outcomes framework, and we were really thinking through what are the motives for this practice. And we wanted students to be able to articulate their learning gains in the curricular and co-curricular environments for whatever their next steps were, whether it was volunteering or whatever, employability, whatever was important to them. So we hosted a series of focus groups with identity-based student populations to obtain feedback. We reached out to each organization and each group, and we talked to their executive committee, and we asked politely for permission if we could come into their space and ask their opinions and their feedback on our outcomes framework. And they welcomed us into their space. They gave us tremendous amount of feedback, and they also shared some experiences with us that made us question: Are we really creating a holistic experience here? Are we really sharing words through which students can articulate their learning, or are we sharing dominant paradigms for how we want students to articulate their learning? And that was a point of critical reflection for us. So when we establish the learning outcomes, as well as the measures of learning outcomes for programs, we really ask students what they hope to learn. And we lean into that language of how students talk about their own knowledge and their development, and use that to build into the framework so that we can encourage the ways in which they naturally express their accomplishments and their learning, and share and use and lean into that. So Ian, would we like to just pick one reflection question and open it, or would we just like to provide this as a list of questions for them to have as a resource?
Yeah, I'm looking at our time. I'm thinking CG and I have a blog post we'll share with you as well, and it has a worksheet where these reflection questions come from, and it really follows the assessment cycle, and then it has a long list of questions. So maybe you just want to speak about the idea of reflection questions, and we'll pause at each stage just so you can see what a few of them are as examples. You certainly can't answer all of these about every assessment that you're engaged in. So the idea is to provide, a menu of things.
Yeah, I think the one I would draw your attention to here is, like, as you currently think through your assessment process as it relates to outcomes, are there opportunities that you are creating or spaces that you are creating for students to identify what they'd like to learn, what they hope to learn, or share their language and their verbiage for describing their learning? So I think maybe that would be the one I would draw your attention to for today's purposes. Anne's going to walk us through the next step in the cycle.
Yeah, so the second step is where we select our methods and we collect our data. And obviously we've compressed all that. That's a huge set of activities, even when we're not intentionally thinking about equity. So we're just breaking this down to a few key concepts for today. So thinking about that balance that we might strike between the demand for rigor and generalizability and the cultural attentiveness and justice. So not every assessment that's being conducted has to serve the same end, if you will. So that's back to CG's point about thinking about the context and the purpose of the assessment. And as we'll talk at the end, like, who's going to use the data and toward what end? It may be multiple kinds of stakeholders, but really thinking about that. Also engaging students, we'll see that as our example on every section, I believe. We tend, I'm a student affairs practitioner by most of my career. And so really the ways that I typically would have done this in the past would be to say, at the end, hey, what do you think about this survey? Or we got some results, do you want to look at them? We really don't think about engaging them deeply throughout the process. And then there's this idea of multiple methods. We often, either it's prescribed, there are things that are institutionally prescribed, wherein we might ask questions of the larger institutional context. But as CG mentioned, multiple ways to demonstrate learning, are there multiple methods for the evaluation? And we've got some resource examples about that that we can share with you. And then really, of course, paying attention to language for implicit and explicit bias. There's a lot of literature on implicit bias, both how to work on that in, say, something like course evaluation assessments, as well as in assessments that we're conducting with our students. And really focusing on whether we're signaling normalcy or homogeneity in the way we even frame the question. So the example that I wanted to bring out here is an equitable outcome for collection and analysis. And this is from St. Edward's University. They had a new gen ed program. And so what they did is they went into their learning management system and they identified course artifacts. And the faculty were heavily involved in this process. And they had some rubrics that they had already agreed upon that they were using. So they identified which dimensions of the rubric were addressed by the particular assignment. And then they aligned those. They worked with their institutional effectiveness office. And they identified some key variables like gender, race, Pell Grant, et cetera. And then they anonymized that. And the faculty scored the artifacts. And then the IEP staff, the institutional effectiveness folks, this is all to protect, the individual answers by the students. They built some visualizations that then showed the rubric scores by different student populations. And they learned a whole lot of things here about the different ways that different groups of students were faring on the assignments. And then they focused more on why different populations over or underperformed, as opposed to focusing exclusively on how did this student do in my course. Not that that was irrelevant, but this was a way that they were looking at systems that might be bringing barriers forward. And then CG, you wanted to talk about this here for a minute.
I will quickly just jump in, and because this is a specialty area for me of content expertise, there are also things to critically consider when we think about our quantitative tools. We know that in many cases, quantitative tools such as standardized surveys are still a dominant method for measuring engagement outcomes in particular, and there are lots of measures like the CLA for student learning outcomes. But we don't often stop to interrogate or critically examine whether or not these tools were designed and standardized with diverse populations or built around diverse samples, and also if they function in fair and unbiased ways for diverse populations. So it's a really important thing to consider when we start to lean into using standardized tools in any format. It's just understanding how they function within our diverse and culturally rich student populations. We know from other bodies of literature outside of the testing literature or like ETS or testing agencies who are certainly doing their own work to examine their tools, but we know from culturally responsive evaluation and measurement that standardized tools often can really falter when it comes to diverse populations. And I think that there's a role as a system, higher education as a system, as an industry, as a role to play in examining whether or not these instruments serve to support systems of inequity or serve to accurately and in a trustworthy manner capture the experiences of diverse students. So just more food for thought in terms of our tools and our methods of evaluation. And you're muted. There you go.
I know my mouse doesn't always cooperate between my two screens here. Yeah, so we just posed these reflection questions here for you based on some of the things we talked about. And they're just things to think about here. I think I would look at the where and how does your assessment language reflect culturally acquired knowledge and perpetuate racism. That's just one example. It'd be sort of a meta look at, say, assessment plans, assessment procedures, the instructions on the website. There's just a lot of ways that there's pieces of the assessment process that we just replicate from research, and then then we borrowed it from someone else, and it hasn't been examined with this lens. And so it's a place to start. So now we're going to talk about analysis.
So this is near and dear to my heart as a mixed methodologist and researcher. Analysis is one of my favorite things to talk about. So one of my favorite quotes when it comes to this work is that data do not speak for themselves. They are given voice by those who interpret them. And I think this is really a very clear departure from that apolitical, aneutral, like I'm a researcher and you're over here, you're my subject, and I am completely objective in understanding your experience. Instead, this really calls attention to the fact that no, our analysis is shaped by who we are and what we know. And so when you think about data analysis and that step in the assessment cycle, some broad generalizations that we'd like to share with you is that it is foundational and so critical to include stakeholders in the interpretation and reporting to ensure, at a baseline, right, that there's face validity to your results. And that's important when we're talking about student learning and demonstration. But it's also an opportunity to mitigate any bias that may be present or to call attention to any language that may be deficit oriented and can be rewritten in a positive orientation. When it comes to data analysis, data disaggregation is critically important. When we think about that system structure, we also know it's important to understand how the variables by which we are disaggregating are shaped and understood. Which variables do we have to disaggregate by and which don't we, and why? These are really important questions to ask and understand. And we also know that engaging in multiple different types of data analysis can really bring to light and unearth stories that otherwise would have been left unexamined. And in some cases, this is how we find not only programs and practices that are working really well for different populations, we also find that when I ask a student a question on a survey, they pick an answer, and I may or may not get a realistic understanding, but if I ask them that same question and give them the opportunity to explain their experience, I can then find that they have a rather robust understanding of the topic area, but they weren't able to articulate that with the selected options I had provided in a testing context or quiz or even just a short response. So these are just broad considerations that we wanted to share with you, and we'll move into some other considerations for you, especially when we consider equity. It's deeply important to not decontextualize your data. An example would be to say that one group of students is doing really well while another group of students is not doing so well, without also talking about maybe the contextual factors that influence those attainments. We have decades of data that suggests that students of color do not walk through and experience or live or embody our institutional experiences in the same ways that our historically privileged students experience and navigate those spaces. And it is not necessarily accurate to completely detextualize that and to treat outcomes and outcome attainment as it's simply a unilateral achievement that is uninfluenced by external context. And so really want to help you think about the idea of student experiences and environments, and whether or not how we report really enforces normative assumptions that students are all having the same experience, or whether or not we can contextualize those findings and talk about how our institutions are working to serve diverse populations. I also think that when you think about any kind of statistical analysis, it's really important to avoid comparisons where whiteness is the standard to which all other groups are compared. So it's really about data disaggregation is important, but how we disaggregate and how we interpret and talk about that disaggregation is equally as important. So one more quote that I wanted to share with you, and I have found this to be important in program review, developing program review, and developing strategic plans, and in conducting assessment and accreditation work. When it's not visibly identified, the default operating is a dominant majority perspective. Persons with non-majority identifications become distant or treated as other, often with oppressive consequences. So this is really, again, that call to bring students into the fold of the analysis, and staff and faculty into the analysis that reflect different walks of life, so that those voices are centered in your approach and in your meaning making with your data. Some last considerations, and again, I would apologize, but I wouldn't mean it, because this is deeply a passion area for me. So we have a couple extra slides here. But when we're thinking about validity and equity, it's really important that we bring the concerns of cultural populations to the center of our validity arguments. And really, when we think about validity, we want to think about trustworthiness. We want to think about credibility of evidence, right? We don't want to necessarily think about, and Kirkhart does, she grounds her work in Messick's work of validity, right? It's that tried and true measurement fashion of validity. But she says it's equally as important that your data is valid across cultural groups and for cultural groups. And so that's really what Karen Kirkhart is drawing attention to. And the ways that we can replicate this in our practice is by thinking about how results will impact marginalized populations. What's our role in having valid and trustworthy data that can either uphold or uproot systems of oppression and injustice that we know are embedded in higher education? When we use this data to tell stories, are the students we're telling stories about given the opportunity to shape those stories that are told? And so I think these are, again, just some important considerations for reporting. Some examples in practice, I have two examples that I can share with you from my practice at my current institution. The first is that we brought data from across 16 different units into one common space, digital space, and then we began graphing out and dashboarding that data. And the reason for that was that to understand our impact on student learning, we first need to understand where we are meaningfully attracting students. Who are we reaching? Who are we missing? Which students are using our services, and why not? Why or why not? are there certain types of programs or services that are attracting diverse groups of students? And how do we make sure that when we go through, hopefully never again, another round of COVID budget cuts, that we don't cut the services that are having the biggest impact on our students who need us sometimes more? Another ways in which we use the assessment process to examine a system, or to examine whether or not we were replicating sociocultural biases that we see all around us in the United States, is we decided to pose the question about whether or not our conduct system in particular was replicating bias in the system that we often see in the dynamics with Black and brown bodies in the police force. And so our conduct director came to me and asked this question. And so she went and she got our data collected, and I did an analysis, and we were really posing questions like, what % of students of color are going through or being routed to the conduct process? We were comparing that to the number of students, or the proportion of students who are being found responsible or not responsible across race and sex. And then also we were asking questions about, are we finding students of color responsible more frequently than non-students? What we found was actually that we have a pipeline problem. We are routing a disproportionate amount of Black men in particular into our conduct process, but that the conduct process itself, they were not more likely to be found responsible or not responsible, or have more severe sanctions, which was another question that we were digging into. So that's just two concrete examples for you. So I would encourage you to think about, not only are you disaggregating your data, but how are you disaggregating your data? How are those variables shaped? And when I say that, an example is I was listening to a presentation on an institution who gave the typical kind of iPads demographic categories for students to select from, and they had 79 students who identified as Native American. When they shifted gears a few years later and allowed students to self-identify with the same general population, they had almost double that number respond as Native American. So how we get those demographic indicators matters as well. So I encourage you to think about that in terms of these reflection questions.
Thank you, CG. So we'll just be wrapping up here on our last piece of the assessment cycle, and then a few closing thoughts. And we'll talk about using the results. We know that using the results is always tricky. It seems to be the place, I know from working at an ed tech company, it's where most people struggle. They put a lot of effort into the data collection, and then it's like, quickly write a report and send it over here, or finish the thing, for the end of year report. But really thinking in advance about the way in which this data is going to be used, who has the power to decide actions and results that are going to come out of the data, so that we can actually effectively demonstrate that the reason we collected the data was not just to meet some compliance standards, but so that we could actually make change, and then we can communicate those changes back to the folks that it matters to the most. Same as what CG mentioned around analysis, really taking a look at our language and how we might be writing our results from a deficit-based orientation. Again, multiple stakeholder involvement, lots of identities and lenses on our work ensures that multiple people are bringing their experience to that. An example I would give you about using results to resolve structural barriers to student learning and success, as opposed to only focusing on the individual student and the concerns there, is the City College of San Francisco Library and Learning Resources Division. They looked at textbook usage. So a lot of libraries have done this, and they looked across for their foundation courses, their gen ed, I think. And they looked at the cost of the textbooks, and then they correlated that with circulation. And lo and behold, the most expensive textbooks were checked out the most often, and they also didn't have, I think, very many copies of those. So what they ended up doing with that, this is the use of results, right? They used this data to request additional money. So they had more reserve books for those expensive textbooks that were required, particularly for gen ed or entry-level courses, had those added to the collection. And then they prioritized textbook purchasing for courses and programs that focused on certain defined marginalized groups that they were looking to expand success and graduation rates with. So this is just one example, again, of using the assessment process in order to actually make systemic change. So we have some reflection questions for you here. The assessment language is really important in reflecting, does it reflect culturally acquired knowledge, and does it perpetuate racism? And for most institutions, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a targeted strategy, but how that operationalizes in reality, not just on paper or in a strategic plan, but how does it authentically operationalize down to the assessments that say I'm conducting in my classroom, or the student affairs is conducting for their programs. There tends to be a pretty large disconnect between the actual assessment process there and the institutional goals and metrics towards equity. So finding the ways to align and reporting and sharing results that you have that can make an institutional impact and difference. So we just wanted to end here with a couple of additional thoughts. And then if folks do have questions or comments, happy to talk about those. And we're going to share resources with you as well. The way we think about this, we used to have a slide that had these two bubbles. It said assessment, diversity, equity, inclusion, and then we showed like a little Venn diagram. And I'm thinking of it more now like centering equity in the middle of all that we do, because it's a mindset, it's a lens, it's an approach. Much like anti-racism work, there isn't really a neutral here. There's either I'm perpetuating systems of inequity and contributing to them, or I'm actually actively working to reflect and understand and dismantle them. But there's not really a middle neutral space. Dr. Jillian Kinsey was a keynote for a recent conference, and she said that having these equity conversations, which can be difficult. It can be difficult for ourselves. It goes against maybe some ingrained ways of thinking. And then when we start to be the person at the committee meeting that's always raising the equity question, regardless of our positionality, that can be challenging, right? So finding peers, this is why we, especially as white individuals, feel like it's our responsibility to continue to do this work and share resources to normalize, if you will. The equity-centered assessment is not like a radical side practice. It is like how we should be doing business, because it's mission-centered for us. Most people, if you look at their mission, they want to serve all students. So we believe that at its core, equitable assessment calls for all of those who lead and participate in assessment activities to pay attention, become aware, if you will, and be conscious of how assessment can either feed into cycles that perpetuate inequities or can serve to bring more equity into higher education. I'm working with a community college right now in Washington, and I'm collaborating with a diversity, equity, inclusion specialist who we're centering equity in the strategic planning process. And she brings this framework, which I really, really appreciate here. What can we do? We can first recognize, which we talked about, systems and self, like where are the inequities? We can pay attention and start to see them below the iceberg, where before maybe they were invisible to us. We can think about specific ways that we can disrupt that. So some of the practices that CG and I shared are ways that people are saying, wait a minute, let me think about this differently. Let me reflect on it. Let me disrupt the habitual way that we've always done this. And then through collaboration, through lots of different ways of knowing and thinking, we can rebuild into hopefully some systems and practices that are equitable and that serve to advance equity for all people, all students. So at the end, we will be, I'm not going to stop on these slides. I'm just going to tell you they're here so that when we share them with you, we've got a great link to a TEDx talk by a first-gen student who I always like to come back to, like, who are we serving again? This is a student telling you her lived experience. And I think it's really good to listen and pay attention. There's the blog post that CG and I mentioned. And a lot of what we talked about here today is sort of embedded in the blog post and in the worksheet. And if you haven't read it, from Natasha is, I know, on the closing panel in moments, former director of NILOA, co-author with CG and I and some others on a forthcoming book, actually, that's coming out about assessment and equity. And their NILOA website is full of case study examples, and specifically, of course, thinking about learning outcomes assessment and the ways that campuses are putting this work into practice. CG has a great, if you're thinking from a student affairs perspective, she talks about critical theory with her colleagues and how that applies. And then we do have on our anthology site a series of podcasts and webinars that are available just, to download and use, and some references for you. So that's what we have for today. And be curious in our few moments remaining if anyone has any other thoughts. We've saved the chat. And I'm hearing from our host that we can get a copy of the participant list because you registered for this session. And so we'll send you an email next week and we'll put a PDF. A couple of the resources we mentioned, we have article resources and some links to some of these things. CG, anything else you want to offer here?
No, just that we know you had many ways in which you could choose to spend your time, and we appreciate you choosing to join us. And thank you also for just your kind words and comments. We welcome feedback. You can't be in the assessment business and not be willing to hear feedback when you get data on everybody else. So we welcome that, but we also do appreciate just your kind thoughts and comments. And we have moments for any pressing, burning questions that anybody wants to ask while we're all here together.
Someone just mentioned, I will say this, it's a shameless plug, but we are co-authoring a book. CG has a chapter in the book, and Natasha Jankowski, me, Dr. Gavin Henning, Eric Montenegro, Gianna Baker, the current director of NILOA. We are deep in the editing process at this moment, and it's about equity and assessment. And so I think it's, December-ish, turn of the new year. It should be out. We've got lots of authors so that the chapters written by other people are really talking about specific practices. We have the history and the literature related to equity and evaluation and assessment field, just sort of to summarize that. So hopefully that will be something that will be useful to you all, and we're excited to be working on it and learning from people while we're editing.
Thank
Yes.
you, Drs. Heiser and Lindquist, for this wonderful presentation today. I want to go back and listen to it so I don't have to pay attention to chats and everything. But please, if you're still here, if you wouldn't mind going to that link, and anything you can answer in that survey and submit will be helpful to everybody involved in this project. Thank you again so much. And you've got a quick 15-minute break. Then at 2:45, you've got next steps panel discussion, and that looks pretty interesting. Have a fabulous rest of your day and a lovely weekend. Thank you all again so very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
And we can keep this open a little bit longer if anybody still has questions. I'll shut it all down when you're all ready to go.
Carry on.
I see it looks like someone might have their hand up.
Yeah, Enrique.
Yes. Just letting you know the all this will be posted. Your recordings and your PowerPoints will be posted in our SO Symposium website, and you will get an email inviting you to visit and see the recordings and the PowerPoint presentations. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question? We didn't share our PowerPoint yet. Where should we send that PowerPoint?
Send it to either myself or Jarek Janyo.
Yeah, Jarek.
The two of we're the coordinators for this
Great.
symposium. Yes.
Perfect. Do you want this? Can it be a PDF? Is that all right?
That's fine.
Yeah, because it's a big file. I just know before it doesn't send very well. Even though I'm in Arizona, I'm close to you, but it doesn't happen.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Kaylan. You're wonderful.
Okay.
I wish I hadn't been monitoring because I really wanted to pay attention. So I'm glad I'm going to have a chance to go back.
Oh, thank you for your help.
Time.
I really appreciate it. It was I had all the chat boxes open and everything. It's a little tricky sometimes, but it was good to have you here supporting us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much. I'm on the student services side of things, but I hear about these all the time. And I thought, ooh, now I have a better understanding. And I'm an executive assistant to one of our VPs. And right now, this is such a hot topic in California.
Yes.
Real curious to see where we go from here.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having us. And we're excited to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
I am going to close this down then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.